Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zapasky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the killers and the authors that have written about them. Today we're going to be talking about a book called Descent into Hell, the true story of an altar boy, a cheerleader, and a twisted Texas murder. University of Texas college student Colton Pitonyak and his girlfriend, ex-cheerleader Jennifer Cave, lived in Austin. Bright, attractive, and from a good family, Colton, a former altar boy, became involved in the underworld of drugs and guns. When Jennifer didn't show up for work, her mother suspected the worst, and her and her family discovered a scene worthy of the most grisly horror movie. Our special guest today is KATHRYN Casey, and we're going to be talking about her incredible book, Descent into Hell. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on the program, and welcome our audience to KATHRYN Casey. Good evening.
Good evening, Dan. Thanks for asking me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, now for our audience, if you could please introduce them to the central figures in this fascinating story. Who was Colton Pitonyak? What was he like? Give us the early background of Colton Pitonyak, please.
Colton was a kid who had every advantage. This is a kid who grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a well-to-do family. His father they had a family business, a farm implement manufacturing company. Colton went all the way through private parochial schools. He was a National Merit Scholar finalist, a brilliant, brilliant kid, the type of kid everybody thought would, go off and make a big name for himself. His mother doted on him. He had one brother, an older brother, and when Colton left Little Rock for the University of Texas, he was in a really enviable position. He had $150,000 in scholarship money to the University of Texas McCombs Business School, which is one of the best in the country.
Right.
So he had all of his ducks lined up in a row, and everybody was predicting he'd come back as Donald Trump, and they'd see his name in the headlines.
Now, let's go back a little bit more. I know you've gone extensively into the family, and there doesn't seem to be anything untoward in his early background, but give us a little bit more of what he was like. Some of the things, obviously, that he's accused of. Let's get a little bit of a background on Colton. There must be something more to his personality that may have led to this incredible story.
Well, it's often in these cases where you have something like this happen. When you look far enough back, you find that there were things. And Colton was the kid. The kids in Little Rock would go out into the woods at night after football games and everything, and Colton was always getting in fights. He was always trying to prove that he was the toughest kid, he was the toughest guy. There weren't very many Asian American students in his school. In fact, there were only 2. And one of them, Colton harassed throughout his school years with racial slurs, pushing his face into the water fountain. It's almost like there were 2 Colton Pitonyaks. There was the altar boy, the good kid, the National Merit Scholar finalist, and then there was this other Colton who was just always kind of on the edge of getting in a lot of trouble. He never actually did get in a lot of trouble, but kids knew that he had a bad temper. And they knew that when he was drinking and when he was smoking pot, he tended to act out.
Now, when did his drug use, his alcohol use start? Did it start like a lot of kids, maybe 16 years old? Did it start much earlier for him?
No, it started in high school, junior high to high school. That was pretty normal, but Colton didn't react like a lot of kids. Like I said, he just had this kind of dark side to him that emerged when he was high or when he was drunk, and he tended to pick fights. All of his friends knew that. They kind of, watched over him. Sometimes most of the time he'd end up getting beat up, but it didn't stop him from going out the next night and picking a fight again.
What were his parents like? Were they aware of his drug use? Were they aware of his anger, his temper? Was there discipline problems within the family? Were they a close family to be able to see the changes in his behavior? Tell us a little bit about just the family dynamic.
They were a close family, and I think they tried really hard with Colton. And there really wasn't any reason to be terribly concerned during those early years. I mean, he was acting out, but a lot of the kids, there's not a lot to do in Little Rock, Arkansas, I'm told, when you're 16, 17, and 18 years old.
Right.
So he tended to, so the kids tended to go out and kind of show each other, who was the toughest guy on the block, who was the biggest man. So he wasn't looked at like he was unusual.
Now, he was a drug user, and in high school, you're saying, say, 14 years of age or so, you would be in junior high or beginning to get into high school. So he started off with alcohol and marijuana, you're saying. Was there a time when he graduated to harder drugs, and when was that time? Did he get in? Was he involved with what was his progression like as a user, and what was his progression like as a person that was seemingly destined to do some good things, an intelligent person with a nurturing, good family? Give us a little bit of the progression. When did it seem to be that he took a little different fork in the road?
Well, when he got to the University of Texas, the first year went pretty well. Actually, the first 2 years went pretty well. He was in a fraternity the first year and lived off campus with a lot of other kids in the fraternity house, a lot of the other guys. But Colton was, when they had the parties around on the tennis court in back of the fraternity house, and he was the one who they'd find the next morning had fallen asleep on the garbage bags out in the alley. And then there were rumors that kind of floated around that one night when he had had too much to drink and too much pot, that he had killed or tortured a cat in the back. There was a dead cat that was found. So early on there were indications that the transition to UT wasn't going well. And he began, when he got to UT, using more drugs. He was using some prescription drugs that he was buying from a supplier, and they were Xanax and Ambien and things like that, and then Coke and everything. And before long, he began selling, and a little bit at a time. I think it often starts out this way. It was just a little bit at a time. But within a couple of years, the kid that had left Little Rock, Arkansas, with big dreams and everybody thinking he would come back as this great success story, was making a ton of money, but he was doing it selling drugs. He was one of the major drug connections on the West Campus at UT.
What type of drugs? You're saying some prescription drugs, but what illicit drugs was he involved? What type of drugs?
Well, he was selling Xanax, and he was selling Ambien, and he was selling not a lot of pot, but he was trading for methamphetamines. Right. And cocaine and just all kinds of things.
Drugs like ice,
yeah.
Some of the heavier drugs, right, akin to crack, cocaine.
Yeah,
okay,
he
now,
really didn't get into meth himself until he'd been at UT for about 4 years. In the beginning, he was doing more of the prescription drugs and cocaine. Okay.
Now, the other central figure in this story, or one of the other central figures, obviously, this is the victim, Jennifer Cave. What was she like? What was her early life like? And you present, and you had incredible access to the family, so it sounds like you have a very, very good picture, and that you conveyed in the book about who she really was and what was her family really like. So tell us a little bit about the beginning of Jennifer Cave's life. What was she like? What kind of family did she come from?
Well, she came from a kind of a troubled family. Her father had a drinking problem and would become abusive, verbally abusive, when he was drinking. She grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, and it was a middle-class family. They lived out in a house out in the country. She had an older sister, older half-sister, and then a younger sister. So there were the three girls. And Jennifer grew up wanting to be a pleaser. She was smart. She did well in school. She had a really almost a photographic memory. I mean, these are two really smart kids we're talking about with Colton and Jennifer, who really had the world ahead of them. But she couldn't quite get it together. She could never quite. She tried too hard to please people. She was a little shy. Her younger sister was the one who had most of the friends, and Jennifer would go along. Jennifer didn't feel very pretty when she was young. She wore braces and had glasses. And then when she got a little bit older, she started blossoming, and by high school, she was turning into a very beautiful young woman. She had red hair, long red hair, and bright blue eyes, and freckles, and she was a very pretty girl. She left Corpus and went to San Marcos, which is just a little bit south of Austin, in between Austin and San Antonio, right, and started school there, and then almost within the first semester got in some trouble. She had been drinking and smoking a little pot before she got to school, and she had a boy in her room, and he had marijuana, and it broke the school rules, and she was kicked out. So within a year after leaving Corpus, Jennifer was kind of footloose in San Marcos, Texas, and ended up in Austin, attending Austin Community College and trying to get her life back together, and that would be the theme of the years to come for her.
What was she pursuing? We've talked about Colton, and obviously he's in business at the University of Texas. What was Jennifer? What was her ambitions? What did she really want to be?
You know, I think that was actually, Dan, one of Jennifer's problems is she really didn't know what she wanted to be. She was one of those kids. She was smart, and she had kind of the career of the semester, and so she changed her mind a lot. Off and on, she talked about being a teacher, and she was talking about doing that again at the end of, within a few years of leaving school. But she never really buckled down and was able to really forge ahead. And her drug use escalated while she was at school, and she started using methamphetamines. A lot of the girls were using them. They were using them to lose weight. They thought, it would speed up their metabolisms, and they'd have no trouble staying thin. They wouldn't be hungry. They wouldn't eat for days at a time. They wouldn't sleep for days at a time. But everybody was doing it. One of the kids told me it was like going to Starbucks in the morning and having a cup of coffee. It was like everybody they knew was doing them.
Right.
So it was just, it was, she fell in with a lot of kids who were having a lot of fun. And Jennifer really kind of strayed for a while. She got off track.
What was tell us, our audience, a little bit about her parents and the situation there, because it does become crucial a little bit later on, not too much later on. Tell us a little bit about the relationship she had with her mother, her father. We've talked a little bit about the relationship with her sisters, but give us a little bit more of that bond. It was incredible what you conveyed in the book, Descent into Hell, about the closeness of this family and their approach to Jennifer's problems, instead of just being aware of it or inversely just ignoring it. Tell us a little bit about her family, her parents, and her sisters and the bond.
Well, her mother, Sharon, divorced her biological father. Jennifer's biological father, years earlier, was a single mom for a while. And by the time Jennifer was in Austin, another man had entered the family, and his name is Jim Sedgwick. He's an accountant, and he had two daughters that were about the same age as Sharon's three girls, and they became a very, very close family. Sharon, really loves her daughters. She talked to them on the phone every day. She did it, she tried to encourage them to move ahead, to do things. There were the ups and downs. There were the problems, but most parents have those with kids, and Sharon had tried really hard with the girls. After Jennifer started getting involved in drugs, Sharon tried laying down the law. She started taking things away or trying to take things away. She, would say, I will pay for college, but you have to prove to me that you can that you cannot use drugs, that you can stay away from this. You have to get a job. You have to work for a while. And Jennifer did. She worked for a while at a really nice steakhouse in Austin, and they loved her there, thought she was great. But then she went on a binge one weekend and didn't show up, and she lost the job. So the drugs were getting in the way of everything, and Jennifer couldn't quite seem to see that, but at the same time she would tell people that she felt like the methamphetamines were chasing her, like they were the devil and they were after her. But this was a very, very close family. These are three young sisters, college-age sisters, and a mom who paid a lot of attention to them and tried really hard with them. And Jim said when he moved into the family, they had 5 daughters. They had his 2 and Sharon's 3, and they became a really close unit. So Sharon knew the day that Jennifer didn't show up at work that something was wrong.
Now let's go back a wee bit here. We haven't we haven't talked about the actual time that Colton actually met Jennifer, and what were the circumstances surrounding that, and tell us a little bit about what was their relationship. Were they boyfriend, girlfriend? Tell our audience how these two met.
Yeah, Jennifer and Colton kind of bumped into each other at a party. They were introduced at a party on campus at UT.
And what year would this be? What year was this?
Oh, Gina, I'm going to have to think back here. This has got to be around 2003.
Okay.
Yeah, about 2003.
So a couple years before, so they knew each other.
So they knew each other. And in the beginning, he would tell people that they had a short-term romantic relationship.
Okay.
But Jennifer didn't want that with him. She had never wanted that with him, or hadn't, if she did ever want that, it didn't last long. And they became really good friends. They were the kind of friends who could finish each other's sentences. They were the kind of friends who, when they got high, would bounce around on the rug and pretend to be different animals and laugh and giggle and be silly together. They understood each other in a very strange way, and people were with them when they were places always felt like, they were kind of left out because Colton and Jennifer, had this attachment. At the same time, Colton was really bad for Jennifer because once Jennifer knew Colton, she didn't have to pay for drugs anymore.
Right.
So she could have anything she wanted. And when you're addicted to drugs, that's a really bad thing. So he was giving her drugs. He became her supplier, and she wasn't paying for them. At times, she would tell people she was afraid of him because she saw things in him that frightened her. For a short time, she moved in with him for a period of, I think it was a couple of months, and then moved out very quickly. And told people that she was afraid.
Now, was there when you talked about Colton saying that there was a brief romance, was that confirmed? Because I think this is important. Was that confirmed by any of Jennifer's sisters, siblings, family, or friends, that there was a brief romance, either at the beginning when they met each other, as Colton described, or when he moved in? Was there any indication that they might have had a sexual relationship?
There's really no indication other than that there's evidence that he still was crazy about Jennifer, that he continued to want her as his girlfriend, and he continued to pursue her. There was an episode where after she moved out of his apartment, she was at another friend's house one night, and Colton showed up, and he came at her. He was practically on his knees begging her to go with him, saying that he loved her, he wanted to be with her. And when she turned him down and said, "No, I don't think of you that way," he actually came at her with a knife that night.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, that's more than a warning sign. Now, at this time, they weren't boyfriend and girlfriend, but did Jennifer have someone in her life? And did Colton have a girlfriend specifically? Even though it's odd, he's professing his love for her and they're just friends. Tell us, this story gets a little bit more complex.
Well, Jennifer did have a man in her life at that point, a guy named Scott, and she was living with Scott and his young daughter, and she went off drugs for a long time, for a period of, I guess it was about 6 months, and really started to clean up her life. Things really started to kind of come together for her. She really found that she was able to function better, and she started talking again about returning to school. She started seriously looking for a job, which is something that her mom, Sharon, and her stepdad, Jim, were just thrilled about because they'd been urging her to for a very long time. Colton, on the other hand, was hanging out with a young woman named Laura Hall. And Laura was a very troubled girl from the University of Texas. She was a communications major. Again, a very bright kid, but she was a very troubled kid. And she had been hanging around with the same group of friends, and she idolized Colton. She thought it was just great that he was kind of this gangster boyfriend of hers. And Colton was pretty basically just using Laura Hall for whatever he wanted, whatever she could do for him, including sex. But there wasn't any real emotional attachment. He was in love with Jennifer.
Now, the person you talked about was Scott Eagle, the relationship she was in. His situation was he was a single father raising a young girl named Mandolin. How does this situation that she is in at that time, you say she seems to be having, straighten up her act and be talking about, very concrete plans of further schooling. What was his situation? What was the situation that she was there contending with that seemed to be significant in this whole story?
Well, she had gotten to the point where she loved the little girl, Madison, a lot. And the little girl was calling her mom, and I think at that point it just became too real for Jennifer, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She told people she really wasn't ready to settle down and be a wife and be a mom yet. She had other things she wanted to do, including going back to school, including getting a good job. And she moved out. And she moved in with one of the neighbors in the apartment complex, a woman named Denise Winterbottom. And she stayed with her for about a month or two before everything happened.
Now, Colton's drug use gets to the point where he is arrested and he is put in jail in a short period of time. Tell us the situation where Jennifer is at that time, where Colton is, and the effect of his short stay in jail. This didn't straighten anybody out. This didn't give any warning signs to, say, Jennifer's family?
Well, that's true, Dan. At that point, when Colton went into jail, Jennifer, it was at that point that Jennifer was able to kind of clean up her life. It was that point the stream of drugs was cut off. The free drugs weren't there. And, nobody was handing them to her any longer. And Jennifer did turn her life around at that point. It was when Colton got out of jail again that the relationship between Jennifer and Scott started to get rocky. It was then that she moved out. She wasn't taking a lot of drugs, but she was starting to use a little bit of meth again. So things had gotten a little rockier. A lot of what was going on with Jennifer was really dependent on what was going on with Colton.
Right. But she always professed her friendship, and also it said that she didn't really think she had anything to fear from him because she was such a good friend. You do mention it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay, just tell it, because there seems to be conflicting. She does say to some people when they do ask, well, aren't you really afraid of him? And she seems to say no with a certain amount of confidence.
Well, she kind of struggled with this whole thing. There was a time period when she wouldn't go to his apartment alone, and she would beg other people to go with her.
Okay.
And then they'd have to stay with her while she was there. And then at other times, she'd say, oh, no, he's all right. He's all right. But then a couple of times she told people she was afraid of Colton, that she was afraid that one night something would happen. And it was never really clear. I think it's this way, actually, with a lot of people who are in these types of really tumultuous relationships. Kind of this love-hate thing is going on. It was never really hate with Colton, but kind of love-fear thing going on with him.
Right.
So, and Jennifer was very young. Remember, these are young kids. So, she was 20 at this point, just going on 21. So things were, pretty fluid for her. One week, she'd sound like she was really worried about Colton, and then a little bit down the road, she would say, "Oh no, he would never hurt me. I know he would never hurt me."
Now we get to the point in the summer, mid-August, August 16th, and around this time, if it's not August 16th, it's the day before, Jennifer actually lands a job at a law firm. This is her second interview, and she goes in and she lands a job immediately. She's hired. It's a prestigious law firm, and this is August 16th. And tell us about that day, August 16th. What happens? She's usually, like you say, a very close family. She's in touch with her sisters, in touch with her mother. Tell our audience about the day, August 16th.
Well, that was probably one of the best days for Jennifer in a really long time. She went in for the interview, the second interview, and they hired her on the spot. And they had a part-time position open that they'd hired her for. And after they asked her to come in and start working right away. So she went right to work that day. And after she had started there for a little while, they, worked for a couple of hours. They saw that she could really do quite a good job for them. So they asked her if she wanted the full-time position they had open instead, which included benefits and everything. And it was right around the corner from Austin Community College, which meant that she could work during the day and she could take classes in the evening. So she was very, very excited. She finished up that first day. She called her mom, Sharon, just gushing about how wonderful this was. And they talked about what Jennifer would wear to work the next day, and what classes Jennifer was going to sign up for at the community college. And she was just really on cloud nine. She stayed in that night, and she washed clothes, and she sat around with Denise and watched television. They watched a movie on the Lifetime Network, and then she told Denise she was going to bed. It was about 10 o'clock. And a little while later, Denise went to bed, and as far as she knew, that was it. What Denise didn't know was that afterward, after Jennifer had left to go to her room, she had talked with Colton, and she ended up going over to pick him up at his apartment. After she picked up Colton, they headed down to 6th Street. 6th Street in Austin is kind of it's the party part of town. It's where all the bars, the tattoo parlors, the shops are. It's where all the students go on Fridays and Saturday nights, and often during the week to hang out at the bars and have fun and drink. And the two of them spent the evening on 6th Street that night.
And she was due to go to work the next morning. She was.
She was supposed to go to work the next morning. And she talked to a guy she had dated she hadn't actually dated. She had just met this new guy, a guy named Mike Rodriguez. And she talked to him a couple of times on the phone that night and said that she had to get home because she wanted to get ready for work the next day. As I said, she already had her outfit picked out to wear to work the next morning.
What time was this? What time did she speak to Mike Rodriguez last?
Well, she talked to him a few times. The last time was around 1 o'clock in the morning. And at that point, she said she was in a parking lot, and Colton was drunk and probably high, and he was walking around, he had lost his cell phone, and they were looking for it, and Colton was angry. And she could be heard talking to Colton in the background. And then she told Mike that she would call him when she got back to her apartment. And that was the last anybody heard from Jennifer. She never did call Mike that night.
So now the next day, obviously, her employer is wondering, but the employer doesn't have a contact number for the family. What's the normal procedure that Jennifer would go through during the day? And this will lead to how people are alerted that she is missing or that they haven't heard from her. There's something amiss.
That day, Denise woke up and went to the bedroom, and Jennifer wasn't there. and she had a strange feeling, not wondering what was going on. But then she thought, oh well, she probably just left early, or she went out last night. So then, when Jennifer didn't show up at the office that morning, they tried calling, but Denise had already left for work, so nobody answered the phone. So then they sent somebody over to pound on the door. Nobody answered, and that person left a note on the door saying that they were looking for Jennifer, that they wanted to hear from her. She had been so excited at work the day before, they couldn't imagine she wouldn't show up that second day.
Right.
So around 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the afternoon, when they still hadn't heard from her, they still hadn't been able to find Jennifer, the attorney that she was working for called her contact number for family, and that number was Sharon Caves. That was Jennifer's mom.
Right.
And got Sharon on the phone and said, Jennifer didn't show up at work today. She's not here. And Sharon, too, understood how excited Jennifer was about that job and how much she was looking forward to that second day. So she immediately knew that there was something wrong. So she started calling the Austin police to alert
Did she call
them.
Jennifer's She called Jennifer's cell phone, obviously, and didn't get any response?
She got Jennifer's recorded message. That was
Would that be normal that she would not pick up? Well, normally people will not just call once, they might call a few times, figuring, geez, this is unusual for a person to pick up. Would she be the kind of person that might not pick up her cell phone or screen her messages? What would she normally do?
Well, she normally would have answered that phone, but she also normally, at times Jennifer would forget to recharge the cell phone. So Sharon's first thought was maybe something happened and she didn't charge the phone, and the phone's dead. So then Sharon had the account. She was the one that was billed for that telephone every month. So she called the provider and asked them to check and see when the phone was last used. And the phone hadn't been used since 1 o'clock the previous morning. And Jennifer lived on her cell phone. Like a lot of kids, she was on it all the time. So at that point, Sharon knew something was very, very wrong.
And it was, despite the past setbacks that Jennifer had, it still seemed unusual, especially now in light of this added complication with the phone and not having used the phone since 1. So at least she's lost the phone. But how important, how much of a sense of foreboding doom did Sharon have at that time?
Well, she was worried. She was really, really worried, and she called Jim, and she called the police and tried to file a report, but since Jennifer was an adult, she had to be missing for 24 hours.
Right.
Before they could take an official report. And the person she spoke with in the missing persons department at the Austin Police Department probably logically assumed that Jennifer would turn up and that this was, something they really didn't have to worry about that much. And that's what she told Sharon at the time. But throughout that day, more things started to fall in place, and Sharon became increasingly anxious. She got this telephone bill. She had them fax over Jennifer's phone bill, and she called the last few people that Jennifer spoke with. And one of them was Colton Pitonyak, and she left a message for him because there was a phone call, I think it was around 10 o'clock that evening, between Jennifer and Colton.
Okay.
Left a message on his phone for him, and then called Mike Rodriguez. And while she had Mike Rodriguez on the telephone saying, well, Jennifer was out last night with some guy named Colton, Colton Pitonyak called and said that he hadn't seen her, that they had parted ways at before midnight. And Mike Rodriguez was on the other line going, that's not true. He's lying.
Because the conversation that Mike Rodriguez had included...
Was at 1.
No, it was around 1, but she did say that she was still with Colton at that time? Is that the conversation?
Yeah, that's right. She said she was with Colton, and it was at 1 o'clock in the morning.
And she was in a parking lot. And
Colton was angry, yeah.
Okay. So he told the mother all those details of that last conversation?
Yeah, he told her about the conversation, about what had happened, that Jennifer and Colton were together at that point.
Okay. That's incredible. And so after she had that information and then Colton had said, "No, we parted ways earlier than that," so she knew he was lying. What was her next response? What'd she do?
She called the police again. And again tried to get them to do something, and they wouldn't. And so then she called Jim, and Jim came home. And at that point, she was really upset. She was very, very concerned. And at one point, they were walking kind of in opposite directions in a hallway at the house, and he stopped and put his arms around her, and she looked up at him, and she said, "This is really going to be bad, isn't it?" And Jim said, "Yeah, I think it is."
Wow.
So the next morning, they made arrangements to meet with a private investigator, and right after that, they headed for Austin.
And how far a drive is that?
It's about 3 hours.
About 3 hours?
About 3 hours, I believe, yeah.
So it was just... Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay.
I was going to say it was just Jim and Sharon made the 3-hour trek. They did. And where they were going to Colton Pitonyak's apartment. Well,
she kept asking the police to check Colton's apartment, and they kept saying that they really couldn't. There was no evidence of anything, even being wrong at that point. They called Vanessa, the oldest of the three girls, Sharon's oldest daughter. She lived up in Dallas, so she started down toward Austin. And Sharon and Jim started north from Corpus Christi to Austin. And they were planning to meet there at Jennifer's apartment. But then on the way, they got a phone call from the Austin Police Department saying that Jennifer's car had been found, and it was parked right across the street from Colton's apartment.
Oh, okay.
So Sharon asked the police again, to contact Colton to go inside and to go inside the apartment because no one was answering the door. But the police said they couldn't do that. They couldn't break in. So Sharon and Jim and Vanessa, coming from the opposite direction, all converged on Colton Pitonyak's apartment right off the West Campus at the University of Texas.
Did they check her car at all for any type of evidence that might have answered some questions for them?
They looked in the car first, and they went up to his apartment and pounded on the door, but nobody answered again. And Sharon had the feeling that she was in there, that Jennifer was in there, and they called the police again, and an officer came out and told them again that there was no evidence, no probable cause to go inside that apartment.
Couldn't the police call? Excuse me. Couldn't the police call? And didn't the police at least call Colton Pitonyak? And weren't they willing at least to call him?
Well, they did try calling him. They did try. I don't know actually that they called him. I think I misspoke there. I don't believe they had a phone number for him at that time. They didn't have a cell phone number for him. But they did leave they left a card on the door and asked him to call them. And they also left one on her car, on Jennifer's car. But when they couldn't get anywhere with the police, Jennifer, Jim, and Sharon and Vanessa all left there and went to a hotel and checked in and stayed there for a while and then went back. And this time they called a locksmith and had the locksmith come out to try to get into the apartment. But he couldn't. There was some type of a security lock on, and they couldn't get in. He couldn't unlock it. So was Sharon continuing to call to no avail Colton Pitonyak? Was she leaving subsequent messages? What was the situation there? Well, she had talked with him a couple of times. She had talked with him when he was on the phone when she was on the phone with Mike Rodriguez when she first learned that he was lying. And then she spoke with him again when he was, and he said, he told her not to bother him, that he was out having pizza with friends.
Oh,
so
wow.
They were less than helpful. From the apartment, they tried calling, or they did call, tried to find Colton's parents, in Little Rock ended up with an uncle instead, or I guess it was actually an aunt. One of Colton's aunts answered, and then ended up with Colton's parents. Colton's father called Sharon, called back, and his response was that, well, my wife tells me that Jennifer's the whole problem anyway. So they were less than helpful.
Wow.
So Sharon and Jim and Vanessa went back to Colton's apartment, and I believe they had one more police officer come out. They went through it again. He wouldn't go inside. He left. The locksmith they had come out came and left, and they were standing there staring at that apartment, I guess around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and wondering what to do. And then Sharon noticed that there was a little piece of glass missing. Well, it wasn't missing, it was cracked, and it was right above the sliding lock on one of the windows. And she started picking at it with her fingernail. And when it didn't move, she sent Vanessa down to get an earpiece from her sunglasses, and she used that and worked on it until she got the glass to fall out, and they swung the lock open. And Sharon was going to go inside. She was convinced that Jennifer was in there. Her car had been right out on the street, was still out on the street, and she was convinced that her daughter was inside, and she thought that she might need help. She could be tied up, be unable to call out for help, could be hurt. Jim wouldn't let her go in, so Jim opened the window and slipped into the apartment. It was dark in there, and shortly after they opened the window, there was this awful, awful odor of death that kind of came toward them. And Jim made his way in the darkness, walking through. The apartment was strewn. It was just chaos. There were things laying all over the place. Bags and clothing and just stuff all over. It looked as if someone had opened every drawer and every closet and thrown everything around, except for the kitchen. The kitchen was clean.
Now he went through the apartment, so he went through and saw some things strewn around in the living room. Where was Jennifer found? And along the way, was there any blood? Did it look like a scene of a struggle?
He couldn't tell if there'd been a struggle or not. It was just such a mess. It appeared there may have been a struggle in the apartment. And he made his way down a long hall and started opening doors. And the first door led to a closet, and then off to the right there was like a vanity area with a sink. And then he opened up the door to a door which turned out to be to the bathroom, and his senses were just assaulted by the smell of death. And he made his way in and turned on a light and saw just an absolutely horrific sight.
Now, for our audience, we don't have a squeamish crowd here. This is important, and it's not just gratuitous, so it's certainly important, the state of the body to a certain degree. So tell us in the more technical terms, I guess, if you'd like, what exactly he found there. Well,
what he could see at that point was a torso and legs, and there was a carpet over from the neck up, and the arms and hands were hidden. The arms were hidden. There were a couple of big garbage bags on the floor, and there was a saw sitting on the chest of the corpse.
A hacksaw?
Yeah, a small hacksaw. And he recognized Jennifer's feet. They had freckles on them. They used to kid her about the freckles on the top of her feet, so he knew it was her. So he went running from the apartment, screaming to call 911. And at that point, the call went out, and the police started to converge. And when they got there, Sharon was hysterical, and so was Vanessa. And Sharon kept saying to Jim over and over again, "Is it Jennifer? Is it Jennifer? Is she dead?" And he kept going, "Yeah, it's Jennifer."
But
so they were brought. I'm sorry, what?
He didn't give any details to his daughter or his wife.
No.
Just suffice to say, she. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dan. What were you going to say? Suffice to say what?
Well, suffice to say that he didn't open the carpet himself. He thought that there might be. He didn't want to deal with the crime scene or tamper with the crime scene. He was at least aware of that, and so he left the apartment. He ran out of the apartment, utter shock. But he did. He went to great lengths to not get any details to his wife and daughter. Isn't that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he told them that she was in there and that it was really bad, that she was dead. But he didn't tell them anything about the scene inside the apartment at that point. And the police started to arrive, and Sharon was hysterical, and Vanessa was, and they were brought downstairs and kept there for a while, kept separated from each other. And then Jim was still up at the apartment, and they were coming, and people were going in and coming out immediately out of the apartment, like the EMTs. It was obvious nothing could be done. Before the body was even examined, it was obvious nothing could be done for Jennifer. So they were treating it like a crime scene at that point from the very beginning. So
now the police.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Now the police found the state of Jennifer. They went in there and did the full examination, and that's the horrible job that these people have. She was decapitated. Her hands were cut off. That's her head and her hands were in the garbage bag. Am I not correct? And there was mutilation. There was mutilation to the face post-mortem, so there was some mutilation and desecration, defiling of that body after she was dead.
That's right. Somebody had taken a knife and poked and played it at the body, just cutting into it. And she had been. They didn't realize until they started getting the body ready, clearing everything out of the bathtub. And when they removed the carpet, they saw that she had been decapitated. And when they moved her body out, then they realized that her hands were gone too. So they, the investigation from that point swung in. They immediately started looking for Colton. Officers were called in. They started searching 6th Street for him. They started talking to people at the apartment complex. A girl a little way down Colton had been over at her house at 3 a.m., and he had blood on his shirt.
Okay.
And he had said that there had been a shootout at his apartment with some Hispanic men over drugs. But Colton was nowhere to be found, and neither was Laura Hall, his kind of would-be girlfriend.
Okay. Now, there was also some gunshot wounds as well, and one in particular that was important to the eventual trial, and also to show the state of mind, and was very important at the trial. Tell us a little bit about the other wounds.
Yeah, when they got Jennifer in for autopsy, one of the things that they did is that they x-rayed the body, and on x-ray they found a bullet in her head, in her skull, or pressed up against her skull at the top of her head. And for a little while they were trying to figure out where it had come from because they couldn't find an entrance wound.
Right.
And they determined that the bullet had been shot up from the wound through the neck, the decapitated head, into the decapitated head after decapitation. So it was as if it wasn't enough that and then they did find the cause of death would turn out to be another gunshot wound. It was a gunshot wound to the chest.
Okay. Now, Laura Hall, we talked briefly about Laura Hall. There is quite a bit of information is gleaned at the trial. We're not going to get into the trial at all, well, the manhunt for Laura Hall and Colton Pitonyak is on. And at the same time that these people are on the run, sort of a Bonnie and Clyde-esque sort of escapade, as Laura Hall later described it to a friend, they're both, again, young people and doing the things that young people do and commenting on Facebook. So tell us a little bit about their flight from justice and what happened next.
Well, they took off that night and headed immediately. When they found out that Jim and Sharon were heading to Austin, Laura and Colton left Austin and headed toward the border to get into Mexico.
Okay.
And along the way, they were making cell phone calls and everything. They were on their cell phones. They were texting people. He texted his mother at one point. We still don't know what he said, but she texted him back and said that it was. At one point, he texted her and said he was heading to Houston when he was actually driving south toward Mexico. So they took off and left, to hide, and went across the border into Piedras Negras, Mexico, and got a room at they first tried to drive farther into the interior of Mexico. They were turned back, and they ended up in a hotel in Piedras Negras. And while they were there, they were going on Facebook and posting things on Facebook. And they wanted, and Colton was going on. He was a real fan of extreme sports, and he was going on watching extreme sports. So they were doing the things they'd always done before, and they happened to kind of befriend one of the managers at the hotel, and ended up spending a night at his house watching extreme sports on his cable.
And what did he observe? How does he play in this as well? He later on he is at the trial himself, but why would that be? What goes on in Mexico at this hotel? They're watching some ultimate sports here, ultimate fighting. Tell us what happens.
Well, it turned out that he was really pretty important to this as this case was brought together, because he was someone who was able to see the state of mind of the two of them at that time. And what they wanted from him is they wanted help selling Laura Hall's green Cadillac that she had driven Colton down to Mexico. And they wanted to dump the car, and they wanted to get farther into the interior. What they had found out is that they couldn't take the car without having the paperwork for it. So the manager, the hotel manager, suggested they go back over the border into the U.S. to get the paperwork, and Colton said, "Oh, we can't go there. We can't go over there at all." And then after they'd been there a short time, they were drunk. Both Colton and especially Colton, but Laura too, were drinking, and both of them had gotten drunk while they were watching it. And Colton started to get paranoid, and at one point acted very threatening towards the manager. And the manager started to be worried for his own life, and so he at one point took a picture. Colton had gotten drunk, and he fell into the playpen that the manager's kids played in,
right.
This little play yard thing, and he snapped a picture of the two of them smiling and laughing. This is 2 or 3 days after Jennifer's murder.
So he becomes an important figure at the trial. Now, we have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of this stuff here, and obviously it's an incredible trial, and we won't give the ending away at all. We got people that are interested so far in the book to go out and buy this book, Descent into Hell. But let me ask, we talked about Facebook, and we talked about some of the comments that they said to this gentleman here. There was some really damning and incriminating statements. Just give us a little bit of some of the statements from Laura Hall. She becomes a very fascinating character in all of this. So give us a little bit more of, you talked, she came from a troubled background, and she idolized Colton. But some of her comments, and again, obviously, we won't get into the entire trial, but give us some of the comments to reveal basically the side of her personality that is conveyed in the eventual trial.
Well, she just came off as being really, really cold, and she at one point she was talking to a friend, a UT friend of hers and Colton's, and he said, "How can you be on the road with this guy? You know what's going on here? Why are you trying to hide him?" And she said, "That's just the way I roll." She just there were numerous comments where she said things about that she loved Colton, and it was like they were on a vacation together. They were on a romantic getaway together, and she showed absolutely no concern at all for the fact that Jennifer Cave, had been murdered, and that her family was dealing with this incredible tragedy back in Austin. So she made one statement after another about her role in this whole thing, and all of them were very cold.
Now, they're both arrested. Colton is extradited back to the U.S. for trial, and then the story gets even more interesting. What I thought was sort of a little bit different than most true crime books was the inordinate amount of sort of psychic connection between the family. You put a lot of that in there. I know that you're used to putting very factual information. Just to wrap up, why was there such a strong psychic connection? There seemed to be a fair amount of premonition. There seemed to be a fair amount of this incredible connection between these people that you did convey in this book, despite always trying to keep the factual information. Why did you feel it important to put that aspect of the book in there?
You know, Dan, there's almost always a little bit of this when I work on a case.
Okay.
But there was so much of it with this case that it just kind of became, I couldn't ignore it. You know, there was just so much. There were just things that happened where they felt as if Jennifer was close. I think this family was so close, and it was such a loving family with Sharon and the three girls, that bond was still partly there, that it hadn't quite broken. And I think partly maybe it was because Jennifer was so young, you know, and it had been such a violent, traumatic death, you know, that it just didn't seem to happen. But even with her friends, but even when they were at the funeral down in Corpus, the elevator door would flutter back and forth until Vanessa would say, "Okay, Jennifer, you can stop now," and then the door would close. There were just things that happened, songs that came on the radio at different times, you know, at a particular moment when it was something that, you know, it was her favorite song. And one of the most strangest things was what happened with Scott. One night he was with another young woman, and they were in bed together, and she felt as if she left her body and someone else had moved in. And then right after they had stopped making love, there was a loud bang downstairs, and he came down and saw a shadow running, you know, kind of flickering through the house into the backyard. And he believed it was Jennifer. There were just so many people who felt that Jennifer hadn't quite left.
Well, KATHRYN, we're at the end of our interview. I want to thank you very much for a great interview and thank you for coming on and discussing your well-written, incredible book of this fascinating story. It's called Descent into Hell. It's a HarperCollins book. This is your 5th true crime book. And again, Descent into Hell, and a great interview with KATHRYN Casey. I want to thank you very much, KATHRYN. Have yourself a good evening.
Thanks, Dan. You too.
Thank you. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Thank you. Good night.